So we're starting a new book. We're starting Sefer Shemot. Okay, that's the easy part. There is this, I'll call it a general perception. I don't know if that's the right word for this. There's this general perception that for some reason, somehow, the situation of, shall we call them, what do you want to call them? The Jews, the Israelites, the proto-Jews, I don't know what to call them. But there's this perception that we have that their religious situation has deteriorated tremendously. So I want to be very careful right now. I'm not yet addressing the issues of the servitude, the avdut, and so on and so forth. As of this moment, I'm just talking about the religious state of the Jews, and what I also want you to appreciate is that when we talk about the religious state of the Jews, we're about to go down, or we could, maybe we'll stop it. There's a potential rabbit hole that you can go down, and that rabbit hole is what exactly was the state of a Jewish people prior to this point, which means, yes, I know we were brought up on this idea that the avot u'mekayem kol mitzvot, but and by the way, I would be very careful about that, and I would say to note, it doesn't say that they performed it; they were mekayem. I think that the way to understand this is that I shouldn't think that because this morning I put on tefillin, so I'm on a higher level than Amram Avinu, even though he never put on tefillin. But Amram, whatever spiritual, religious, mystical thing is supposed to take place when I put on tefillin, I'm pretty sure that Avram Avinu got to that without putting on tefillin. And by the way, you do realize or recognize how this concept could be potentially, the proper word to use now would be antinomian, because then you would draw the conclusion and say, well, if one can reach this point without doing these actual mitzvot, then what do I need all of the mitzvot for? And by the way, and there are places within certain Hasidic writings that almost gets you up to this point in terms of this antinomian thought, and then you essentially will have a Litvak reading the Hasidic thought and saying, well, these people are apikorsim. But you just again have to realize it comes back to this exact point, and that is spiritual fulfillment. Sorah, I really truly believe this is not just to make feminists happy. I truly believe that the religious environment in Sarah's tent was higher than any religious environment I've ever seen in my life. And I hope that this doesn't sound like some kind of radical thought. It's not. There's a reason that they are considered the avot and the imahot. So now, if we then go down a little bit and go down to the time of Yitzchak and Rivka, and you go down to Yaakov and whatever complicated relationships we have there, and then we go down to the time of the next generation of the tribes, and the next generation, which means by the time that they're in Egypt, what is their spiritual identity? So what I have then is, on the one hand, I could be influenced by this midrashic, rabbinic, Talmudic perspective. Well, everybody kept everything, and I even saw, if anybody really wants, I can share it with them, but a very nice cartoon kind of thing from, I think it was a Belzer Chumash instruction manual, which is showing Noach's kids, all of them with payas, and so whether Noach's kids actually had payas or not, I don't know. I think is a really interesting. No, they didn't. Again, it's not an interesting question. I'm saying if I were to send this to you, you wouldn't even know what to do with it. But it's essentially somebody saying, well, this is how we are today, so it must be how they were yesterday, and goes backwards in time, and therefore what is was. But I'm going to say it again. You go back to the time that the Jews were in Egypt, and you start to contemplate, start to think critically. So what exactly was their religious identity? What was it based on? What did they do? What didn't they do? What was expected of them? Which means, again, if we have this perception that there was deterioration, what was the deterioration based on what? So again, if you'll tell me that the various mitzvot, which are mitzvot b'nei Noach, so then I think you're on very, very firm ground to say, yeah, mitzvot b'nei Noach make a lot of sense. There's actually a whole literature as to what was the identity of the Jews before Matan Torah. Are they considered to be like Jews? Are they considered to be like b'nei Noach? There's a book called Parshat Drachim, that the whole first essay is on that. So if you want to read more about that topic than you ever could possibly imagine, that is the place to take a look at it. So I'll say again, what is it that they did or didn't do and what deteriorated? And now I want to be careful, because our knowledge is probably based on a combination of three different things. And it's going to be the third one, which is most interesting to me today. But the first one is kind of just general Jewish knowledge, kind of stuff that we know. And when I follow that path, stuff that we know, so then there is this teaching that the Jews fell to the 49th level of Tumah, and if they would have remained one more moment, then they would have disappeared. And again, we know that. So I kind of wonder what would happen if I were to tell you that that teaching does not appear any place in Chazal, and I'll define Chazal as ancient rabbinic thought, which means Mishnah, Talmud, Midrash, that whole strata, Tosefta, and so on, that whole strata of knowledge. And I'll say it again, that concept does not exist within that whole strata, which means it doesn't appear until, as far as I know, until around the 16th century, the Arizal, and so on. But it's interesting because, again, any of us who went to yeshiva, that's part of what we were taught. That was just had we stayed one more moment, we would have disappeared. Why? Because again, we had deteriorated so much. So I would just stop and say, what was the deterioration? And essentially, you're going to have a very hard time getting to any kind of definition other than saying that they were over Avodah Zarah, that they were guilty of idolatry. Because I'm going to say it again, what else was it that they did? But nonetheless, I'll say it again. But that is in our heads, but I do want to make a comment about this. Where did they get the number 49 to say that we fell to the 49th level of Tumah? And the answer is very simple. It is from the Omer. Because by the Omer, we climb up 49 or perhaps 50th level. By the way, not that I want to deal with obscure Kabbalistic teachings right now. I'll feign complete ignorance. But I can tell you that there is a serious argument in the 18th century and 19th century whether there is in fact a 50th level of Tumah or only 49 levels of Tumah. So you'll have people who will quote this teaching, like the Orach Chaim, who'll say that one more moment they would have fell to the 50th level of Tumah, and then you have people like the Vilna Gaon saying there is no 50th level of Tumah. There's only a positive 50th level, and that 50th level is revelation at Sinai. So therefore, Sinai is the 50th level, knowledge of God is the 50th level, something which is, again, that level of spirituality, but there is no opposite, which means, according to this teaching, if we fell to 49 levels, then during the Omer, we have to each day counter it and climb up one level. So therefore, you climb up. Why do you have to climb up 49 levels? Because you're 49 levels deep. So each day you climb up, and then eventually you get to Sinai. But can we all get biblical for a moment? Yes. Based upon actually the Chumash, based upon Parshat Emor, Sefer Vayikra, the whole concept of the Omer has nothing to do with Egypt. Should I say that again? The whole idea of Omer has nothing to do with Egypt. The whole idea of the Omer is something which is completely agricultural. By the way, look at the word, Omer. It has to do with an amount, it's agricultural, it has to do with the springtime, it has to do with bringing the Korban HaOmer, it has to do with the Korban HaOmer, getting up to the Bikurim. It is all this agricultural aspect of Judaism, which now, to admit, is completely foreign to most of us, well, I hope not to us. It's foreign to most Jews because they don't live in an agricultural society, and therefore this whole agricultural aspect, which includes things about Sukkot and things about Pesach and things about Shavuot. I did it in the wrong sequence. Things about Pesach, things about Shavuot, things about Sukkot. And by the way, when you look at it that way, Sukkot is in fact at the end of the year, not at the beginning of the year, because Sukkot is the end of the agricultural year, even though it's the beginning of the calendar year. And that's why you have some confusion taking place, because essentially we live in multi-calendar existence. But pause there for a moment. If you live in a non-agricultural world, and nonetheless you still have this thing about Sphira, so look what the Arizal did. It's completely brilliant. He either reveals, unveils, or creates, I don't care right now, this spiritual aspect to what the counting of the Omer is about, even though the Pshat level is completely agricultural. He says, no, the agricultural is there to mirror something which actually took place in Egypt, because when we were in Egypt, we sunk to the 49th level of Tumah. But I'm going to say it again. If you actually read Vayikra, this says it's not there. It's absolutely unknown to any of the Rishonim because it's something which, as I said again, doesn't exist. So I think it's always fascinating when we give religious meaning to things that we don't necessarily understand or connect to, but or again, I'll completely accept this possibility that Rizal is not being innovative, but rather he is revealing. But either way, it has nothing to do with Pshat. So I'm going to say it again. This idea that the Jews sunk to the 49th level of Tumah, you're not going to find that in any classical place within rabbinic literature. You only find it in later places and later sources. And the only thing that I'm leaving out from my discussion is the Zohar, because perhaps in the Zohar you will find things, but I'm going to leave that out because that is essentially a mystical book, which one could debate how much was known, not known, or when it appeared, or we're not going down that path right now. I will point out something which the Rambam writes, which to me is absolutely fascinating, and it's in Hilchot Melachim, where he deals with the Sheva Mitzvah B'nai Noach, which may, according to him, be a misnomer. Of course, he says, Al Shishadvim Nitzda Adam Arishon. He actually, instead of all 7 are B'nai Noach, no, Adam already was commanded of 6. Al Avodah Zarah, Birchat Hashem, Al Shvichut Damim, Al Gilei Arayot, Val Hageza, Val Adinim. Which is all quite interesting, that according to the Rambam, the Adam was commanded not to worship idolatry, and not to curse God, and not to murder, and not to be guilty of Gilei Arayot, sexual sins, Gezel, Dinim, that would really be other kinds of mishpatim. Afal pisha kulan him kabbalah biyadenu b'Moshe Rabbeinu. Even though the Rambam stresses that the authority that we have, it is not because it's Sheva Mitzvot or Sheish Mitzvot, or not because that God said anything in Bereshit. The Rambam says this in Chulin. It's the more famous place that he says it, even though it's very clear over here. In Chulin, there's a chapter called Perek Gid Hanasha, and there it talks about, guess what? Gid Hanasha. So there the Rambam writes that Gid Hanasha was revealed to Yaakov, was told to Yaakov, and it was accepted. It says Al Kahn b'nei Yisrael in the future that we don't eat the Gid Hanasha from Yaakov onward. And the Rambam there writes, but Judaism is based upon Sinai and based upon Moshe Rabbeinu and based upon what Moshe Rabbeinu received from God, and therefore the reason we don't eat Gid Hanasha is not because of Yaakov. That's just a nice narrative within our family history. But legally the reason we don't eat it is because God commanded it to Moshe. Now if you read this line again, you realize he just now said the same thing over here. He says that even though that V'afa pishkum kabbalah biyadenu b'Moshe Rabbeinu v'hadat notel lahem miklal divrei Torah yiresha al elu nitztaveh. I'm skipping a little bit. Hosif l'noach ever menachai. Shenem Maran quotes the pasuk, and therefore nimtza sheva mitzvot. So all this is clear to us. V'cheni adav b'kol olam ad Avram. And that's the way the world was spiritually till Avram. But Avram v'nitztaveh yeter al elu b'mila. Now, we're going to come back to Mila because that's going to be very important. The radical change, which we could argue, again, it goes back to this point when Judaism begins, the radical change takes place when Avram Avinu is commanded on the commandment of Brit Milah. That's the game changer. By the way, that's Avram Avinu's conversion. Why do I say that? When somebody converts, they have a Brit Milah. Why, unless they're a woman? Why would I say that? Because his name has changed then as well. Avram becomes somebody new at that point. By the way, who else gets a new name at that point? Sarah, because there's this conversion for Sarah as well. That's when Judaism begins. At that point, Judaism begins, and I'm saying that afilu yesh lanu tekes, right? We have some kind of a ritual to mark this by, and therefore the Brit becomes very important. Another thing I want you to pay attention to, because we're going to be coming right back to this, that the term which we use for this is Brit. And what does the word Brit mean? It means a covenant. That means that something new has taken place at this point. V'hu palel shacharit, so it's interesting. Nitztaveh, right, he's commanded regarding Milah, but he prayed shacharit. V'yitzchak yifresh ma'aser, again, not commanded. Yitzchak did the mitzvah of ma'aser, separating ma'aser. V'hosif tefillah acheret lifnot hayom, and prayed another prayer at the end of the day. And by the way, there's a little bit of tension here, because the Gemara tells us 2 reasons why we have the tefillot. One is because the Avot did them, and the other because of the Korbanot. The Korban, which is the Tamid Ben Arabayim, was actually brought much, much earlier in the day. So if you want to if you want to daven mincha the way that they did the Korbanot, you would always daven mincha gedola. If you want to do mincha the way that Yitzchak did it, you would always do it lifnot hayom at the end of the day. which means here you actually have a contradiction, not a contradiction, but you have a tension between the two sources. It's the same time frame, but the korban is always done as soon as possible, so that's the earliest part of the time frame, but it says that Yitzchak daven right before sunset at the end of the day. So as I said, spiritually, whatever you connect to, but it's interesting that there are these two different sources, and the way he stresses that he davened. Another one, Lefnot Hayom. V'Yaakov hosif gid hanashe. It's interesting. Yaakov hosif gid hanashe. Yeah, Yaakov had a nocturnal experience whereby it may have been a dream or a nightmare, and somebody attacks him, and he wakes up limping, and he said, no, we're not eating gid hanashe anymore, and that's what it says. Yaakov hosif v'hitpalel arvit. Again, state. So all of that was an introduction. It's the next couple of words that I don't begin to know how to interpret, but we'll see what to do with them. Uve Mitzrayim, now you realize why we're here. Uve Mitzrayim, nitztaveh Amram b'mitzvot yiterot. Amram was commanded with other mitzvot, which means instead of our perceived deterioration of the religious life in Egypt, the Rambam just now told us, in fact, we received more commandments in Egypt. By the way, not by Moshe. Moshe itself would have been much more interesting. No, Moshe would be less interesting. It would be more intuitive, right? If it were Moshe, we say, yeah, of course, Moshe, right. Moshe told them to do things. Amram? How did Amram get into the story? Who in the world is Amram? Well, apparently Amram is somebody quite important. There are various midrashim which tell us about the stature of Amram, but the Rambam just in his history of mitzvot, his history of halacha, just now introduced Amram into the story. Amram nitztaveh Amram b'mitzvot yiterot ad sheba Moshe Rabbeinu v'nishlama Torah al yado, and the Torah was completed based upon him. Amram is this most interesting thing in the middle, and now I go back to my question. So what exactly was the nature of Judaism, if that's what we can call it, during the time that they were in Egypt, especially keeping in mind that there's this other comment over here having to do with Amram. And again, if we were studying this halacha, we can read all the commentaries, we can go searching down all the leads which they give us, or we can do what others do, and that's simply guess. What in the world is going on here? What in the world is he talking about? But don't you love the Rambam who can say this with all the confidence and not bring it it's not the moment of Vulcan. This is his Mishnah Torah, and he tells you, yes, this is the history of halacha. In Egypt, the Jews had more. By the way, there is a wonderful midrash which says that in Egypt, the Jews started to keep Shabbat. Where do you get Shabbat from? And then it gives credit to Moshe Rabbeinu. It says that Moshe Rabbeinu is wandering around and he sees the slaves, and then he turns around to his, what do you want to call him, his surrogate grandfather? Is that who it would be? Surrogate, right? Because he's adopted by Bat Paro, so then Paro would be a surrogate grandfather, and he says to him, you know, I've been studying efficiency in the universities of Egypt, and we get greater work efficiency from workers if you were to give them some type of rest. So then he says, well, what do the studies show? Well, the studies show that if you give them 1 day off in 7, then they will be more efficient. He goes, which day do you think is best to give them off? He goes, probably Saturday is the best day to give them off. And Moshe fools Paro into ordering that the Jews rest on Shabbat in order. Again, by the way, this whole midrash is so wonderful, but according to this midrash, first of all, Moshe knows about creation, and he knows, and by the way, I have no problem with any of that. He knows about creation, he knows that God rested on the 7th day, he knows that one day God is going to command Shabbat. And especially if you think about the scene by the burning bush where Moshe is very reticent and he doesn't want to get involved, and who am I and what are you talking about? And now you say Moshe the lawgiver. Moshe is the one at Sinai God's going to give the Torah to. And now you find out that there's this wonderful midrash that Moshe already, it's not that he gave them the law, it's that the first time that Shabbat becomes a possibility for this generation of slaves. And by the way, this changes everything in terms of how you understand Shabbat, but it's such a beautiful midrash. So there you have Moshe already giving them Shabbat while they're in Egypt. But
if they built an Erev.
If they built an Erev, if it was a real Rishut HaRabim, it depends how they pass in Rishut HaRabim. So 1 second. I told you that there were 3 different things in order that we would keep in mind. One is our general consciousness, which really is very much impacted by the Arizal and by this mystical teaching. And again, I don't know why. It's very interesting to me why certain mystical teachings have absolutely entered into all the day schools, into all the high schools, and all of the consciousness of the Jewish people. Start looking for, where do you get this from? And it's not in the Gemara, it's not in the Midrash. Where do you get it from? No, that's in our head, and that's the 40th level of Tumah. One more moment, we would have disappeared. Good. The second thing which exists, which I now started to get to, is this world of Midrash. And the world of Midrash is really fascinating, and it tells us various things, and we're going to look at some of them. But then, at this point, I'm holding off a little bit, and then there's something else. And that something else is probably why you came, and that is, what does the Torah actually say? So what intrigues me, then, is how exactly do we match up various Midrashic traditions with what it actually says in the Torah? And that is really going to be our challenge for today. So at least I hope now that I've given us some kind of a framework to what it is that we're looking for, and let's start to look. We have to stop. Ve'elishmot. The problem is the Vav. The problem is the Vav. What does the Vav tell you? Yes, this is a new book, but it's a continuation. There is some connection right now. Just in case you think that you could have skipped all of Bereshit and understand Shmot, what's the answer? No, you can't. This is a continuation. Ve'ele Shmot. Ve'ele Shmot b'nei Yisrael b'nei Mitzrayma. Isha Kovish. Now, I skipped all the names. One of the problems that the Midrash is going to address is that all the names were already said back in Vayigash, same exact verses. So why do you need the names to be said again? We'll keep that in mind. V'yamat Yosef v'kol achav v'chol dorahu. So now we're told, okay, so forget about Yosef, forget about the brothers, forget about all of them. Uvnei Yisrael paru v'yishritzu v'yirbu v'yatzmu v'ma'od ma'od. V'tumalei aretz otam. You know what I would say right now? If there's Sheva Mitzvah B'nai Noach, one of them is Peruvu, look how the Jews are doing what they're supposed to be doing. Again, just following through. Are they doing what they're supposed to do? Yes, they're doing what they're supposed to do, and that's our first indication of what the text actually says. By the way, if I were to pause right now, what would I now say? But again, I know nothing else. What would I right now say about them? They're tzaddikim. Why? Look at the percentage of positive mitzvot that they have that they're keeping. And what percentage is that? It's really, really a good percentage. So at this point, I would stop and say that this generation or generation of tzaddikim, by this way, we still have to get back to our possible deterioration. Now, if I were inclined today to get a little bit more mystical, Yosef is actually connected to the previous pasuk of Peruvu. If you don't know this, then you don't know this, and that's fine. But the name of God, which is used throughout Bereshit, whenever there is going to be talk, I don't want to overstate this, the major name which is used in connection to having children is the name Shakai, Shin Daled Yud Shaddai. That's the name which is used. That name is more connected with Yosef than anyone else. Yosef receives, when Amram is commanded regarding the Brit Milah, that's going to be very important. The name which is used in that context will be Shaddai. Later on, Yaakov will receive the bracha. He'll give it over to Yosef, and he's going to give it in terms of fertility and having children. And then Yosef receives the strongest blessing of fertility when he receives Berchot Shaddayim Beracham, blessing of the breasts and of the womb. It is absolutely blessings of fertility. That's what Yosef receives. And the name Shaddai may actually also be connected to breasts, which means it's a question of flow of milk from a mother to a child and a flow of life and so on. So again, Yosef is absolutely connected. So therefore, even though that the Melech Mitzrayim lo yadat Yosef, and the word yada is actually much more interesting because of Adam yadat, Chava ishto, and the Eitz Hadat, and again, this is a continuation of the previous book. Don't forget that book. There's a lot of interesting things over there. But the people seem to not just remember Yosef, they seem to be beneficiaries of this blessing. They seem to be involved in the mitzvah Peruvu. Now, really simple, without getting deeper, what is Paro trying to do? He's trying to absolutely frustrate that. He's trying to destroy that, and he's trying to stop them from multiplying. So again, just read the next verse. The Melech Shelo Yadat Yosef Yomer Elamo Am Bnei Yisrael Rav Atzum Mimenu. What's the first thing which is interesting about this? Am Bnei Yisrael Rav Atzum Mimenu. So you could just, correct. You could just focus on the fact, they're so numerous. It's not that they are so, it's that they are so numerous. This is a separate people, which means the description over here of a separate Am, the reason why this is going to be so, so important and so interesting is the perception of the Egyptian leadership is this is a separate people. And now my question is, but what is the self-perception of the Jews in Egypt? Do they see themselves as a separate people? Or do they see themselves as part of this other people? Which means, what is going on over here? I'm not even calling this a subtext right now. I'm asking a really simple question. And of course you realize that in a world where it seems to be that anti-Semitism is they say the oldest hatred, it's the oldest custom, right? It's a custom. What else can I say? It's this ingrained custom which people have been passing on from parents to child.
Nimrod was the first anti-Semite.
Yeah. It really is strange. There was this Canadian singer, Morissette, who found out recently that she was in fact from Jewish stock, that there were Holocaust survivors who never told that they were Jewish. And she said that she always felt comfortable with the Jews, and her parents, and her mother was always very positive about Jews, but I think that's exactly it. Do you inherit this hatred? Have you heard all the kinds of comments that's been passed on from generation to generation? Or have you heard positive things, or even positive things, which means it's a completely irrational hatred. Over here, the first key is that these are a separate people. They're not the same people. And that claim that this is a separate people, I'm sure you hear echoes going on with Haman as well, right? Right? These are a separate people. So it's as much as perhaps the Jewish fantasy is that we are good citizens and we're going to fit in and we're going to be part of this larger country that adopts us or allows us to live there. And then the question is, again, I don't want to be overly pessimistic with the exile, that how long does this last until we get this message that no, that's just not the case? And over here, the first thing is, the core of the issue is that Am B'nai Yisrael Ravatumenu Hava Nitchak Malo. That's a really interesting word. Let's act wisely with them. Pen Yirbeh, that they increase more. V'haya ki terkarenu l'milchama, and if a war begins, v'nosaf gam hu al sonenu, they will join our enemies. That means that the Jews are considered to be, what's the term, a fifth column? The Jews are considered to be not part of everyone else. The Jews cannot be trusted because if the winds blow the other way, they'll be joining the other side because they are not truly patriots, they're not truly part of us, that it goes down to tribalism and they're not part of our tribe. They are part of something else, and they are different. And then he says, which is really interesting. So it sounds like the fear is that they're going to leave. So then what's the consideration? I want to try to keep them. But why do you want to keep them? Let them go. Be gone with them. So go. Kick them all out. Exile. Which, and by the way, you know Jewish history or world history, that's happened a few times. But I want you to read really carefully, and I'm going to tell you exactly what it is we're looking for. If I tell you what we're looking for, it's going to make it too easy. So you want me to make it easy?
Yep.
Should I dumb down things for you? Yeah, who said yes? So this part we'll dumb down for you, because we had some people asking for dumb. If you read source number 2, that's the Brit Bein Abtarim. By the way, keep in mind, what word is important in Brit Bein Abtarim? Brit. Which means this is the covenant. This is now. Of course, you can be clever and question me and say, "Hold it, this is not the same as the Brit Milah." First of all, say, "Calm down." Secondly, let's read this. Vayomer la'Avram Yodea teda ki ger yezaracha be'eretz lo lahem. Now, if I ask myself, okay, so where does that actually come to fruition in Sefer Shemot? Well, that happened pretty quickly over here. That's exactly what Paro was saying. Am b'nei Yisrael ram v'atzomenu. They are a separate people. And this next pasuk again, that they're going to join our enemies. That means they are a ger be'eretz lo lahem. Now, what their own personal perception is, you can guess. I have no idea. Each person may be different. Do they celebrate the 4th of July? Do they celebrate? I don't know. I have no idea what to say. But then it continues, va'avdum v'inu otam. And they will be enslaved, and they will be, how do you want to translate inui? Abused? So when we go back to Shemot Perek Aleph, what are we looking for? This is not going to, we already found maybe the harder thing to find, so let's just keep on reading. So Paro has this problem, and look, they're going to leave. Pasuk Yud Aleph. V'yasimu alav sarei misim leman anoto. Did you just now notice something? Mm-hmm. So what is abuse? Answer? Taxes. That's abuse. But it's not just taxes here. It's an unfair taxing of Jews is going to be abuse. But I'm saying that's really interesting because we have in front of us the blueprint of what's supposed to be taking place. And that's why I'm saying that this is easy, and that's why I said, should I make it easier for you? Yeah, just put the blueprint up and then say, so what are we looking for over here? As we continue, right, we start with the taxes. Says, whereby the inoi ken yirbeh v'chen yifrotz. That means the inoi didn't help. It didn't help. V'yakutzu minei b'nei Yisrael. Again, here you also have a level of disgust. V'ya'avidu mitzrayim b'nei Yisrael b'farach. And now you have the other word that we were looking for. Which means if I'm looking for the Brit Bein Abtarim and saying, so when and how does this come to fruition? When does this manifest? I just had to read the first 15 verses or so of Shemot, and now I see it. And by the way, if you're not convinced about the avodah, you haven't noticed it yet. And the next pasuk, V'armut chayim ba'avodah kasha b'chom lovineim uv'chol avodah b'sadeh et kol avodotam asher avdu. How many times do you need the word avodah in one pasuk to say, hold it, I think it's trying to tell me something over here. So when we look at the Brit Bein Abtarim, at least as far as what is the negative, what's going to take place, I hope you see it all staring at us over here. But then something else happens, and that's Pasuk Tetvav. Vayomer Melech Mitzrayim l'mialadot asher ivriot Hashem achad shifra v'shem achad pua. Vayomer bi'aldeichem et ivriot re'item ala avanim im benhu v'hamiten oto v'im bati v'chaya. So right there, we got to a new stage. And the new stage is murder. Murder is not part of the blueprint. Inui, avodah, that was all that was supposed to be here. Which means it's at this point that Paro now has overstepped what it was. Again, if he were to say, listen, I'm just following God's rule over here. I'm following what God wanted. So that's where things go too far. Now, again, I want to pause. What is the state of the Jewish people at this point? And I hope that you tell me that you don't know. The only indication we've had so far is that they are multiplying, which is part of what they're commanded to do. And we don't know that much more about their state in terms of their religiosity. The Ramban is really quite interesting in source number 3. Hava nitchak malo. So why does he use, let's do this in a clever way. So, by the way, every one of the commentaries that I read, that I learned preparing to give the shir today, I'm thinking at least to one side of my brain. So what was their own personal experience with anti-Semitism, with terrible kings, with people who are abusing, with people who are, trying to find clever ways in order to deal with their quote-unquote Jewish problem. So we know a bit about the Ramban's history, probably more so than some of the others. Hava nichmak malo, lo ra'a paro v'chachmei yoatzav lakotam b'charev. First thing is that he's told, that he says, is that Paro and his advisors think it would be unpolitic to actually commit murder. כי תהיה בגידה גדולה להכות חינם העם אשר באו בארץ במצוות המלך הראשון. Because these Jews came here with permission and the blessing of the original Paro, again, as far as we're concerned right now, there are lots of previous Paros, and therefore he's going to run into political problems if he goes and wages an all-out war against the Jews. I'm saying this line is absolutely fascinating, even to indicate that Paro is starting to consider, how is this going to read in the op-eds of the newspaper? How am I going to be open to attack? Or people are not going to like this. V'gam am aretz lo yitnu reshut lemelech lasot chamas kazeh. Essentially, he just now identified two different groups. He said one is the leaders are going to say that, this is not right to do because it goes against a previous paro. You have no right to do that. Secondly, the average person will say, how can you go and act in such an immoral way? Which is really interesting because now you're assuming that the population in Egypt are very moral people who are going to insist that all populations, strangers in their midst, are all treated with respect. Kimam hu mityaetz, because he actually, asked for advice. Va'afki b'nei Yisrael amra v'atzum v'yasu imam b'milchama gdola. And even though there is this threat which is looming, aval amar she'yasu derech chachma shelo yargishu Yisrael ki be'ei v'yasu b'hem. Let's do this in a way that the Jews won't even realize that they are the ones who are being attacked right now. Ulakach hitil b'hem mas. So how do you start this? You start by taxing them. But by the way, good patriotic Jews may actually feel a responsibility to pay the tax. It's a patriotic thing to do. Government is asking for our help. We're part of the government. We want to forgive. Again, that's really part of what I'm really thinking about. I want to know what the verses indicate one way or the other. To what extent are the Jews, Israelites, as you wish, they're perceived by Paro as being this fifth column, but how are they perceived when it comes to themselves? What is their own self-perception? So when they're taxed, do they say, this is terrible? Or they say, and they point to the bridge. No, we built that bridge. This is our tax money went over here. And again, there's nothing like Jews who can suffer from their own self, what should we call this, misperception. Ki derech hagarim ba'aretz lalot mas lamelech kemo shaba b'shlomo. Kings and taxes. V'achrin tziva b'seter l'mialdot l'rog ha'zachirim ala avanim. And then he secretly said to kill the males. V'afilo yodot atzmam lo yadu behem. V'achrin tziva l'kol amo kol ha'ben yilod yorot tishlochu otam. V'nyan shelo ratza l'tzavot l'sarei hatabachim asher lo l'hargam b'cherev hamelech. O she'ashlichu heim oto li'or. אבל אמר לעם כאשר ימצא כל אחד ילד יהודי ישליך אותו ביעור. ואם יצעק אבי הילד אל המלך או לשר העיר יאמרו שיביא עדים ויעשה בו נקמה. Which means he made it sound that basically Jewish blood, dam Yehudi hefker. That's the point here. Dam Yehudi hefker. But it's really being told to people. Again, if you realize what the Ramban just now said, if you want to kill Jews, why not just get your army to go and kill Jews? Go to war. Why do it in such a way, the milaldot, and then people throw them into the river and so on? There's more effective ways to do this. And he says, no, that would not have flown politically. That would have been difficult. He has these other considerations, the advisors, the old leaders, the people. And he says, bonit chakmalo, this whole thing is being done in a way. And again, this is fascinating. Go ahead, kill a Jew if you want, and then the Jew's going to get upset. Let him come to court. Let him bring witnesses. Let him bring evidence. Let him go and prove that you killed him. So again, when I read all of this, I really wonder about the Ramban's own experiences as he's trying to explain to us what it is that took place. There's a couple more things that I want to touch upon. One is, when he says that maybe Yalu min haaretz, they'll join the enemies Yalu min haaretz, so it's so obvious to us. I want to make sure that we see the pasuk one more time, and then we'll look at what the Ramban says. This is the fear that they're going to join the enemies. It's in pasuk Yud. They'll join the enemies. V'nilcham banu va'alam min haaretz. Now, I would have read that without any question. Va'alam min haaretz means they're going to leave the land. They're going to go back home. And the Ramban actually says that as a secondary thought, but look at his primary thought. V'ulai yomar v'ala alinu min ha'aretz asher hu yoshev ba, yirmaz la'eretz Goshen. That what was the fear? That the Jews are going to leave their ghettos and start moving into our neighborhoods. I'm saying, again, this is precious that he's saying this, but we're going to see a little more, hopefully, about Goshen as we proceed. Source number 4, one second. Yeah, the second thought is that he says, oh, maybe it means Ve'elam ha'aretz hazot eretz Canaan im kol asher lanu, that they're going to take all of our things, v'lo nuchal nachnu n'komnu k'meinu mimenu l'elchem bo, and therefore we're not going to be able to fight back, which is fascinating. The Ramban actually gives the Exodus story as the secondary possibility that arises in Paro's mind. That Paro's immediate thought is that they're going to leave their land where they live and come and live in our neighborhoods. That's his fear. That they're actually going to leave, that's like a secondary thought. Okay, good. Source number 4 is the Midrash and Midrash Rabbah, when it talks about Ve'ele Mosif Shevach al Rishonim, and it goes down to say that Kulam Hayut Tzadikim, which means Ve'ele Shemot, if this is continuing, and those are Tzadikim, by the way, the implication should be that this new generation is also Tzadikim, Ve'ele Shemot B'nai Yisrael, and we continue. Although, almost immediately, the Midrash, by the way, that's Midrash Rabbah's Siman Bet, and here is Siman Lamed Daled in source 5, when he says, Vayiskor Elokim et Brito, Vayiskor Elokim et Brito. Now, Brit should have been in our minds from the beginning here, that there's a covenant, and what's the covenant? The Brit Bein Abtarim, Vayiskor Elokim et Brito, Vilo Hayu Re'uim Yisrael Lihinatzel Lefi Shahayu Rishaim. The Jews were unworthy of being saved because they were wicked. So here you have wickedness being described. It doesn't say 40th level of Tumah, it says that they're wicked. Ella bischut avot nigalu, because they had schut avot. Should I say that again? Because they have schut avot is the reason why Geula takes place. Haduhu dichtiv yiskar elokim et brito. And that's why it says, and God remember the covenant. Which means if there is a covenant, there's something larger which is taking place, and we may be unworthy of it. When we look in, just moving a little bit further in source number 6, which is again a little bit further, it's Siman Lamed Vav, it actually is a great back and forth midrashically to what extent we're deserving or undeserving, which is a wonderful, wonderful metaphor. And it says on the word, Vayar Elokim b'nei Yisrael v'yada Elokim, Yoda Kadosh Baruch Hu sha'alav l'ga'alam l'man shmo b'avor habrit shekaratim avot. God knew that he had to do the Geula because of the covenant. And then it goes a little bit further, Vayar Elokim, Amar Ratzalom shira'ah she'em atidim lihimarot al Yamsuf, but he saw that they're going to rebel. And then it goes further and it says, you know, that, okay, they're going to rebel, but then they're going to come back and say, Ze'eli, they're going to point their finger and say, that is our God. Probably that Reish Lamed is Reish Lakish. Rav Shua ben Levi Amar, Ra'ashidim Lomar, Elohech Yisrael. But on the one hand, they're going to say Ze'eli van Vehu, and the other hand, they're going to say Elohech Yisrael. That one is talking about by the splitting the sea, and the other is talking about by the Chay to Egel. By the way, you realize now that we are very inconsistent people. We have our highs and we have our lows, and I love this divine back and forth that are we deserving or not. That we're going to say Naseh Mishra. But on the other hand, and you can keep on going, is that we're going to do this, but we're going to do this, we're going to do this, we're going to do this. Are we deserving or are we undeserving? Deserving, undeserving, and it keeps going back and forth. But what's the bottom line here? The bottom line is, but there's a covenant, and God is going to keep us on the covenant. But again, when I ask, what is the spiritual state? So what's the spiritual state? Not just in Egypt, what's the spiritual state? Ongoing for the Jewish people throughout history, what's the spiritual state? And what's the answer? It's we're work in progress and we're and in flux. That's the issue. We have our good days and we have our bad days. And again, interesting. We go backwards now, and source 7 is Siman Chet. Rabbanan Patra Pitcha L'Haikra, they explain this verse in Hosea, B'Hashem Bagdu, they rebelled against God, Ki Banim Zarim Yodu, they had foreign children, Ata Yodu Chadash Zeh Chokeim, L'Mamdecha, what does all this tell us? Ki Shemet Yosef Heferu Brit Milah, that when Yosef was born, they stopped performing Brit Milah. Now that's really important because which word? Sorry. Kishamet Yosef. When Yosef died, Hefiru Brit Milah, they stopped doing the Brit Milah. And the reason why this is so important, because what word is there? Brit, which means that our side of the covenant is not being kept. And now, again, if you're going to be contractual and go to court and say, one side's not keeping the contract, is the other side obligated by the contract? The problem is the other side made the contract with the avot. Didn't make the contract with the kids, he made the contract with the avot. But the next three words are the ones which are haunting. Amru, niyeh kimitzrim. And they said, let's be like the Egyptians. So now, when I go back and I ask my question from before, when Paro says there is this OUisrael, this separate people, what is the perception of the Jews regarding their identity? So now you have a midrash which is clearly telling us, by the way, it tells us a bunch of things. The Brit Milah is incredibly important because that's the beginning. That is this covenant with Avraham, right? So we kind of rejected our identity with Avraham. And what are we saying? We're going to be Egyptians. By the way, again, what are the Egyptians saying? These are not us. These are not our people. We're going to get rid of them. Let's get smart and deal with them. So you have the Jew trying to assimilate, and then you have the non-Jew trying to stop the assimilation. Well, how do they stop the assimilation? Because they want to make sure that we know that we are not them, and they stop it in their way. We're not going to get to it today, but the last source I gave you is the Beit HaLevi. And the Beit HaLevi, Rav Yosef Dov Soloveitchik the first, Rav Soloveitchik's great-grandfather, he goes through this point about them not keeping Brit Milah. He actually modifies a little bit. He said they did the mitzvah, but they try to cover it up. Don't ask. Very painful surgery to try to deny the Brit Milah. And they knew that the slavery was coming, and therefore let's make it as easy as possible upon us. They know that there's this Brit Bein Abtarim that they have to go through the hundreds of years of being another. So instead of being another, let's try to be as much as we can like the Egyptians, and let's try to fit in as much as possible. It'll make life easier for us. They're going to like us a lot more, and we'll be like everybody else. Which is interesting because when I read this midrash, I'm reading a sign of weakness that they want to fit into everyone else. When I read the Beit HaLevi, he's saying it's a strategy. I find, by the way, the Beit HaLevi very hard to take at face value. But again, I start thinking about when the Beit HaLevi lives and in terms of the Haskalah and people wanting to fit in and trying to be like everybody else. As a strategy for Jewish survival is that, again, if only we were to be, again, Jews in the home and non-Jews on the street, and you all know what I'm referring to, will they then like us more, or is that then just going to, at some point, metastasize into a Holocaust? So, again, reading some of these commentaries and then keeping in mind the times that they live in and what they're dealing with, I found fascinating, at least for me, from beginning to end. But let's go a little bit further. How far have we gotten to? We got to source number 7, which says that they said, no, let's try to fit in. Let's try to be like everybody else. It's all going to work out. What can possibly go wrong? And we will be like the Egyptians. Now, there's one more thing that I want to keep in mind, and then I finally, at some point, want to get to some verses to try to see where we're getting all this from. And this now is going to get to a verse. It's not a verse you expected. It's in source number 8 in Vayikra. Somehow we find ourselves back in Vayikra, and it says, "K'masei Eretz Mitzrayim asher yashavtem ba lo ta'asu, k'masei Eretz Canaan asher ani mevi etchem shama lo ta'asu, uvechukoteim lo telechu." Now, the first thing which is important about this verse, which I just now managed to completely take out of context, is actually to know the context that it's in. And the context is that this is an introduction. Well, it's always two possibilities. Is it finishing the previous part, or is it introduction to the next part? The next part, which is coming, is a list of all the forbidden sexual relations. And it says, don't do what they did in Egypt, don't do what they did in Canaan. So if I read the Ibn Ezra, remarkable. Kamasei Eretz Mitzrayim, ala mishpatim. That's talking about decency in terms of business, in terms of laws. That's fascinating. What is it that they did in Egypt, which is the problem? They didn't keep the mishpatim. Now the Ramban quotes the Ibn Ezra, but he quotes a different Ibn Ezra, same Ibn Ezra, but just a different citation. He quotes the Ibn Ezra a couple verses before, and I'll tell you what the Ibn Ezra says. He writes, "Uvavor sheskir divrei ha'seirim shayu osa b'mitzrayim nismach hazu haparsha v'harayot al ma'aseh Eretz Canaan." He actually divides them. He says Eretz Mitzrayim, according to the Ibn Ezra, was sins which they did in terms of avodah zarah, idolatry, but the sexual sins, which means the previous section, right? This is Parsha Achrei Mot. Achrei Mot deals with the Avodah of Yom Kippurim. Afterwards, it deals with idolatry and services that you shouldn't do. So the Ibn Ezra is saying is Masei Eretz Mitzrayim is the idolatry, but Eretz Canaan is the sexual depravity. So that's the way the Ibn Ezra reads it, and the Ramban disagrees. He says that's not the case. I'm just going to skip and look where the Ramban in source 10 is bold. Valdat Rabotenu b'tart kohanim hayugam hamitzrim shtufim bizima. By the way, there's good evidence of that. The Egyptians were sexually immoral. Our first two meetings with Egypt, right? Sarah gets there, they kidnapped her. Yosef gets there, right? They hit on him, which means the Egyptians seem to be a place where they are hot-blooded individuals. We'll leave it like that. The Rav Hirsch actually goes into that a little bit because he says, "O b'nei Cham." So if you're b'nei Cham, what are you? Answer: you're hot-blooded. So he says, "Hayu gam mitzim shtuvim bizima b'kol arayot u'v'zachor ve'ema v'hu ha'emet." And he's saying no, and this is the correct interpretation. The Pardes Yosef, he focuses on the second half of the verse. What can't you do? Uvachukoteim lo telechu. Who's chukoteim? The ones of Egypt and the ones of Canaan. Don't follow their practices. And he essentially says, he quotes from Misvat Emet, that whatever you do the opposite. You want to know what proper behavior is? Whatever they do the opposite. This is Jewish wisdom. It's very interesting. By the way, the Rambam in source 12 is not that different, but he's understanding these things in terms of morals less so than in terms of law. But the reason I actually went here is because of source 14. But before we read it, I want to go back and read the pasuk one more time. In 8, Kemasei Eretz Mitzrayim Asher Yoshavtim Ba. So what does that phrase add when it says Asher Yoshavtim Ba, the place that you lived? So the Mizrahi, which again generally is a commentary on Rashi, he writes, it's Eretz Goshen. Eretz Goshen. Dim lo kain asher yashavtim balamali. Egypt was worse than all the other nations, but Eretz Goshen, that Goshen was worse than any place else, and he's referring to source 13. They were the worst of all the nations. So he went ever so slightly further than the Sifra, but it's very fair what he said. And now we're completely perplexed. Yeah, Egypt is a completely immoral place, but Goshen was worse. So what was so bad about Goshen? Listen, sometimes you go into Jewish neighborhoods, I don't want to say Lashon Hara against Jews, you get into Jewish neighborhoods, so what do? Okay, they don't park very well. They double park, triple park, right? It's universal in every, okay, I'll try to behave. But what did they do so bad? I'm saying that's my question. What did they do so bad? And it's saying, this is the worst. The worst of the worst are the Jews. So this verse, again, if you take the interpretation of the Sifra, you now have, again, you take the Ibn Ezra and the Ramban, I hope you're following me now, and it says, don't follow the practices of Egypt that you were in, is either connected to the previous section, which is one of Avodah Zarah, and this would point then to the idea that the Jews were involved in idolatry, or it's leading into the next section, which is one of sexual sins, which means the Jews were involved in sexual sins. By the way, what's the advantage of those two interpretations? They're both part of the Sheva Mitzvah B'nai Noach, which means, so what was so bad? What did the Jews do so bad? What was the terrible things? So now you get to pick. Was it the previous thing? Was it the next thing? Is it they were involved in idolatry? Is it they were involved in sexual sins? But again, what it is saying is that Goshen was worse than any place, and that's really interesting. By the way, it's also interesting in them saying in Paro's, the way the Ramban read, they may leave Goshen and come and live with us, and we don't want them around because the Jews are so depraved. Can you imagine that? Again, we always look the other way around. The Egyptians are so bad, and we're so good, right? And now you realize the crazy place that we got to now. We got to this possibility. It's that the Egyptians they see us as separate people, and part of the reason they see us as separate people is because we're people that don't have values, which is not what you wanted to hear. You wanted to hear how good we are and how good we were. But it goes back to this point that all the Midrashim are following this and saying that that the reason that God is going to take us out is because there is a covenant with the Avot. So again, I told you I wanted to get to a couple of psukim. The first one that I want to get to is one that you know, and you're very, very trained to read it in a very specific, and I'm going to suggest limited kind of way. Moshe wanders out of the palace, and Moshe sees his brothers, which itself is a phenomenal concept, because Moshe knows that those are his brothers. Moshe knows the slaves are his people. It would have been very easy for a person to have raised in the palace to completely forget the slave generation, the slave people, the slave strata, and these people have nothing to do with me. And instead, it says, "Vayihi b'yomim ha'hem," source 15, "Vayigdal Moshe v'yitzei el echav vayar b'sivlotam." He sees their pain and he identifies with their pain. Vayar ish mitzri makeh ish ivri me'achav. And he sees one of his brothers being beaten. Vayifin kol v'chol vayar ki ein ish vayachat mitzri v'nina b'chol. Great. So Moshe becomes a freedom fighter. Moshe becomes this is the beginning of Moshe as a goel. Moshe as a redeemer. Moshe was born to lead. Moshe was raised to lead. He was educated to lead. You're right, why are you hitting your friend? Again, can you imagine how disappointed he is? Moshe would love to believe that the Jews act on a higher moral level than the Egyptians, and here he sees the Jews. Now again, you've been trained to believe that this is Datan Vaviran, because you've been trained to believe that there's this third conservation of bad characters, and again, I keep calling them the Cheech and Chong of the Bible, that these are the guys that every single bad thing that happens, there's only two bad guys. There's only two bad guys. And now I'm going to ask you, can you possibly entertain the possibility that there's more than two bad guys among Bnei Israel? Is it possible that we've been reading this very, very generously? No, there's only two bad guys. What if these are absolutely representative of the others, and they're beating on one another, which means the Jewish behavior is not all that good? And remember the comment of Mishpat of the Ibn Ezra said, "Oh, what they don't follow the Mishpatim. It's the Mishpatim. It's basic laws, basic ways to treat one another." And Vayomer, and they say, "Mi samcha leish sar v'shofet aleinu." Who are you to become the judge of us? Are you going to kill us the same way you killed the Mitzri? Right, Moshe gets afraid. How does Paro find out about this? And the answer is, and this is my suggestion, is that these people see themselves as being Egyptians. They don't want someone to be their leader and to be a separate people. They don't want to be. And again, it's the exact inverse. Where do Chazal see anything in the verses that the Jews identified as Egyptians? And the answer is when the Goel, the Redeemer, comes and is there ready to take action. Why did you kill the Egyptian? Why did you kill this man? Which means they actually think that they are part of the Egyptians. The fact that Paro finds out about it, in whose interest is that? Unless they want to be good law-abiding citizens. Do you know what this guy did? He went and killed an Egyptian. You can't kill an Egyptian, which means who's the snitch? Who's the one who ratted Moshe out over here? And the answer, it's only the people over there, which means it's the slaves who did it. Maybe it's these two people that did it, which means there's something really remarkable over here which is taking place. And all that I'm asking, again, I'm asking myself, where do we see in the verses that they're saying, no, let's be like the Egyptians, we're okay over here, and even if they're given various taxes and pay taxes and maybe even slavery, we want to be part of this nation, so a desire to fit in is something which is staring at us over here. And by the way, what happens afterwards? So Moshe leaves. And then what happens? And then he saves this damsel in distress, which means Moshe is still the Goel, but instead he becomes this redeemer for these girls off in Midian someplace. And Moshe is going to do what he does, but he kind of understands now that the Jews are not the ones who really are, and this is terrible. He comes to this realization that they're not really redeemable. And if you realize this, because he tried to start it. He tried to help, and he's told, and he's reported on that they don't want to leave. Can you now read the whole conversation between God and Moshe at the Sneh a little differently? God says, Moshe, no. And by the way, it never says there, that's the other thing I wanted to point out, it never says, I want you to follow the whole narrative until God says, by the Sneh, I'm going to take him out. The whole focus is never that they prayed to God. No, it says they scream. God hears their cries. God hears their scream. But it's never that they pray to God. The relationship with God is completely silenced, completely absent. But God hears and God remembers the covenant, which means they are suffering, God remembers. But what about their religious identity? The lack of them actually asking God. The second thing is, what I started to say, is that God knows it's time, and God knows that there's a covenant, and even if they broke the covenant, God is going to keep the covenant, and Moshe is looking at it saying, like, what are you talking about? Are they going to listen to me? Not because, again, as we always read it, that Moshe has a great deal of humility, and Moshe doesn't really think that he's worthy. That's not it. Maybe it's part of it, but that's not it. It's that he's tried once. Because these people don't want to leave. These people think that they're part of Egypt. These people are not the ones who are waiting for a Redeemer to take them out. And essentially God says, go. By the way, the other thing that I wanted to get is also, it's something which I think you know, but we already have to stop, right? The other thing is that, do you remember that God says, go and speak to the elders, speak to the Zakanim, and then you go in front of Paro. If you follow the whole thing there, God says, you and the Zakanim should go in front of Paro. And he goes and speaks to the Zakanim, it sounds like they believe, and then when they get to, none of the Zakanim are there. And the Midrash says that they kind of disappear along the way. Every single one of them disappears in source 19. So it says, Amar Rabbeinu, Alchu imam hazakenim, Oyu magnivin et atzman v'nishmatin echad shnayim v'chu lahem kivin shagia lepalterin shel paro lo nimtza echad. Which means all the so-called leaders are not willing to fight, and not willing to declare their independence, and not willing to say that, no, the time has come for us to leave. They all disappear. Which means when I go back and I ask my question, okay, so what is the state of the people at this time? The Midrashim, as I said, start with the Kabbalistic teachings, 49th level of Tumah. Go to the various Midrashim, they rejected Brit Milah. Rejecting Brit Milah is really interesting because Brit Milah could represent all kinds of other things as well. First of all, it's a covenant. Secondly, it may also be connected to sexuality and arayot and other things as well, and a rejection of all kinds of sexual mores. And maybe that verse, again, I spent some time with that verse in Vayikra, maybe that verse is more important than we think about. These are the actions of Eretz Yisrael, till we finally saw the Sifra telling us, oh yeah, what is it, the Medrash Halacha saying, what is it they did? Oh yeah, Goshen was worse than the rest of Egypt. And that, by the way, is a game changer. That Goshen could have been worse than Egypt. And then we actually see that Moshe's into the various, all that I said is follow all of the narratives and all of the discussion and what's taking place. And what do we actually see with these people? We start off, they're all doing mitzvah pruvu. All that's great. But then as we continue, are those two people representative, or are those two people just two individuals who are having, a bad religious day? But maybe they are representative of the people, and who are you? Because, and now I'll finish in, because they're Egyptians. And once you realize that they think that they're Egyptians, now you can understand where the Midrash is getting this from. There's a lot more which is under the surface there, which we're not going to have time to get into. But the combination of these things, including the leaders, are all kind of disappearing, and Moshe then saying to God, like, what do you want from me? These people don't want. But what's our conclusion? And this is really important. The conclusion is this whole story is about a Brit. The story is about a people who forgot the Brit, and people who broke the Brit, and people who stopped keeping the Brit. But there was a God who remembered the Brit, and God said, I made a Brit with our ancestors, and God says, I'm going to keep the Brit. In the cloud in the background of everything else that I'm saying today, specifically the news that I don't listen to, or the papers that I don't read, and specifically today, what I'm going to say is that sometimes we have good days and sometimes we have bad days as a people. And sometimes they're confusing, and sometimes we don't even know, is this a good day or a bad day? What I will say is that the reason that we're here, and the reason we're going to win, and the reason we're going to survive, and that is because God made a covenant with Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, and God will keep his side of the covenant.